Hello everyone, this is the first update on my progress in the Saga Age of Magic challenge. So just to recap, Little Legion's channel and Leon T66 channel have challenged one another to build a 8-point Saga Age of Magic warband by August the 1st, and they've invited anyone else who wants to join them to tag along. It's been quite a large uptake of that offer already, and my own attempt is going to be to create a warband based on the theme of the Arabian Nights, and also I want to build it entirely of figures and models that I printed at home on my own 3D printer. So it's kind of like an added interest to me, having recently acquired a 3D printer, just to see what it's capable of. As you can see, I've now got the supplement for the Age of Magic, and I already had the rulebook, version 2 of the rulebook. I'm a long-standing player of version 1. At the point that version 2 came out, though, I wasn't really sort of wargaming at the club at that point, and it's remained in its cellophane wrapper because it's very much a two-player game. It's not the sort of game you can play solo, and none of the people that I was gaming with outside of the club were really into Saga, so it's been mothballed for a while. But this has certainly renewed my interest in it. Anyway, so I've got I'm sort of vaguely familiar with the rules already. I've now got the supplement, so I can work out the correct, sort of way of setting the warband up in terms of spending points and so on, that I was in the dark about before. Same situation as Terry at Grandad's, what's it called? Grandad's Art Space, I think. He hasn't got the supplement yet, and he's sort of winging it a bit. Yeah, and I had already begun to paint before this dropped through the door a certain number of figures, just based on what I thought it was going to be probable that I'd be able to use, and I've completed 5 figures, which I'll show you soon at the end of this video. But I just wanted to talk basically about the way my thinking's going. I found that even though the Arabian Nights idea is very much centered in fantasy and magic, that the factions in this rulebook don't really kind of accommodate it very comfortably at all. There are only there's 6 factions in all in here, and there are only 2 that I was, even vaguely considering. One of them was the Other Worlds, and I couldn't really get it to work because, well, for a number of reasons really. Although there are lots of, say, fairies and enchantresses and sorcerers and so on in the stories in the Arabian Nights, it's very much set. The stories are very much set in the sort of in a sort of golden age of history, really, for the Islamic world, which is the Abbasid Caliphate, and in particular the sort of period of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who gets mentioned in the stories quite a lot, and is a historic character. He was contemporary with Charlemagne in the West. So it doesn't really work to have a warband composed, made up out of characters and so on, creatures that come entirely from another world. because there's very much a sort of human element to it, you know. So all my Hearthguard and warriors and so on are going to have to be human rather than animals or anything like that, or even supernatural beings. So the Otherworld faction was written out, and it only left me with the Great Kingdoms, which fine, because you know in particular the Abbasid Caliphate was a great kingdom, but then it became a little bit difficult to find a way of journeying in so many of the sort of supernatural kind of beings, such as jinn and so on, into the composition of the force. I've worked out what I want as a monster, and that's about it really. Because I'm in the Great Kingdoms faction is allowed one unit of creatures, which would be 2 figures, but I'm finding it a little bit, you know, problematic at the moment, thinking about what creatures I've got in terms of files that would be suitable, you know, to fit into the Arabian Night setting. Anyway, so that's where I'm at in terms of my faction. It's definitely going to be the Great Kingdoms. In terms of, you know, how I'm going to model it and paint it and so on, I mean, I can obviously start with historic kind of armies. So certainly this Osprey book, The Armies of Islam between the 7th and the 11th century, I mean, this has a few illustrations of warriors during the Abbasid Caliphate. So for instance, there's an Abbasid standard bearer there, and you can see how ornate their dresses. I mean, this is the joy of painting any Islamic army, really. I mean, they had such kind of colourful and exotic clothing and so on. So my mind is, you know, working along the lines of doing something like this only on steroids, you know, really exaggerating the fantastical kind of elements of the dress. And you can really take any kind of Islamic civilization really and you know, glean ideas from it, because the Arabian Nights stories circulated right the way through sort of, you know, the great Islamic civilization. So the Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate obviously play a major part in the stories, but you know, Cairo is mentioned, so the Mamelukes, the stories filtered down into Mughal India. Damascus is mentioned, as I say, Cairo. So there's any of these sort of themes would work. I could sort of grab ideas and inspiration from any of these books. So as I say, that's my thinking at the moment, is to take all these sort of really brightly coloured, you know, exotic uniforms and arms and so on, and just really exaggerate them. So in that regard, you know, I've obviously been reading the Tales of the Arabian Nights, and I started with this volume here, which I got from a charity shop in town a few years ago now. Just saw it on the shelves and thought, oh yeah, I haven't got the Arabian Nights, I might as well pick it up. It was £2.50. Now this particular book does have a lot of illustrations in it, so there's lots to be, you know, lots of kind of ideas to be gleaned from this. Reading it though, I think I mentioned this on my last video when I kind of announced my intention of taking part in this challenge. This is the sort of Victorian polite kind of version of the Arabian Nights. I don't know when this particular translation was made, But the Arabian Nights is really raunchy. There's lots of very kind of rude and impolite language in it. This has a lot of the flavour of the original stories removed, and that process really took place in the Victorian era, who were really offended at the the sort of open kind of conversations about sex and bodily parts and all that kind of stuff. So it reads in a very kind of stilted way, plus there are things happening in it that you have to kind of construe the reason for them happening, because all the sort of sexual innuendo and so on is taken out of it. But the famous, I got hold of this book, which is an absolute delight. You can see immediately from the cover. This is the translation made by Sir Richard Burton, who was the famous Victorian explorer. Burton and Speke were the two main characters you think of in terms of the search for the source of the Nile in Africa. But Sir Richard Burton was a famous Orientalist and linguist and so on, and he travelled a lot in the Islamic world. He actually managed to disguise himself as a Muslim and get to Mecca, which would, if he'd been discovered, it would have been certain death, but he could pass himself off as a Muslim and so on, and get all the way to the Mecca. But he translated quite a lot of Arab and Oriental works. The Kama Sutra is a good example of one that has been regarded as a sort of bit of a naughty book to read. He was responsible for translating that, and he made his own translation of the Arabian Nights. The language is totally different, not only in terms of the fact that he retains a lot of the raunchiness, but he writes it in a very florid and almost kind of Shakespearean language. So it's really fun to read this. And this, apart from the fact that it's really beautifully, the pages and so on are really beautifully decorated. There are a lot of illustrations in this book as well, just like the other one, with the added bonus. I'm not going to find out now, but with the added bonus that a lot of them are in colour. So, for instance, there's a colour picture there. There's another colour one. But there are also, there we go, there's a lot of black and white, so that a lot more detail and ideas to be gathered from this book. I left the page open, or the page marker, at this particular one here. So this is an illustration of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, a historic character. Gets his name crops up in an awful lot of the stories in this. But you can see immediately this is an ideal kind of source of inspiration, because it takes all those colours and patternings and so on that were in the Osprey books and just goes overboard in terms of representing them. It's almost a sort of psychedelic rather version of those colours. So I've really been sort of going to town with the way I painted up these figures, which you'll get to see in a minute, I promise. Just to sort of, in case you're not really familiar with what the stories of the Arabian Nights are, I might as well talk a bit about that in this first video. That they're a collection of stories. There is no one named author or writer of them. In fact, there are no named writers, but they've certainly kind of accumulated and and grown as the centuries have gone by and stories have been added to them, but they're still regarded as a kind of complete body of work. And the reason for that is that they're all tied together by this initial kind of premise that the stories are being told to a king whose name is Sharia, by his wife Scheherazade. Now, the background to that is that the king and his brother, younger brother, were both betrayed by their respective wives, and Sharia himself came to the decision that in order to avoid a further kind of betrayal of of the wife being unfaithful, he would marry, and then at the day after the wedding night, whoever he had married he would have put to death, so that the wife that had sort of taken up marriage contract with him would have no opportunity to break her vows of marriage. So he rapidly got through the female population of his kingdom, really, in this tyrannical kind of method of marrying and then executing wife after wife after wife. And Scheherazade was the daughter of the Vizier, and the Vizier was the one who was responsible for finding the king, his wives, and she asked her father to present her in marriage to the king, and her aim was basically to win him over, and if she succeeded and survived, then she would have not only saved herself, but she would have saved the female population of the kingdom, because his tyranny would have been brought to a close. And the stratagem was that she begins telling him a story on the first night of their marriage, and the stories are really involved and intricate and interesting and entertaining, but she never ends the story, so the king has to leave her alive to the next night in order to get to know what the sort of page turner was and what happens next. And this partly comes, so Scheherazade is described as being a very kind of beautiful woman, but also well versed in literature and so on. So she has kind of accumulated all these stories over the years in her head and is able to just roll them out one after another in a never-ending succession of stories, until the point where they've been married for quite a long time. She's presented the king with children and so on, and he suddenly realizes that he's in love with Scheherazade and perfectly happy with the marriage, and she's going to remain faithful to him. And on top of that, the stories all have a kind of moral. They're almost like parables. There are lots of stories about injustice and the fickleness of fate and fortune and so on, and learning to forgive and learning not to be rash in your judgments and all this sort of thing. So there's two kind of things binding the stories together, even though they come from so many different Muslim cultures and are collected over many centuries, that they're bound by this theme that they're all being recited by Scheherazade, but also they've got this sort of uplifting nature to them. Whilst they're entertaining and they're quite saucy, they're also very morally kind of educational. So it's really worth reading. So on top of that, obviously the sort of the setting has appeared in a great many movies and TV shows over the years. So I've been watching some of these, and these have been another way of kind of giving me ideas about creatures and so on that I could add to the warband, and also colours. This one in particular, The Thief of Baghdad, is Michael Powell was the director, and this was made in the war years in 1941. They started off making it in England, but they had to move to the US to complete it. But it's really good book. I mean, obviously a bit dated, but the colourings and the setting, the sets and so on, really sort of worth a watch. Good view. I've bought this box set of the 3 films featuring Sinbad that will all feature the animation techniques of Ray Harryhausen, who's most famous for Jason and the Argonauts and all the monsters and so on in that. So I'm getting a lot of ideas in that about what particular creatures and so on I might be able to use. These stories, although they use the name Sinbad, I mean, as far as I can tell, none of the actual plots are in the Arabian Nights. I've already read the section that deals with the 7 voyages of Sinbad, and none of them bear any resemblance to these films. I've only seen the first 2. I've yet to watch Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. The 7th voyage of Sinbad was made in 1958, and it's really dated. A bit disappointing. Obviously very low kind of production values and so on, but it does have some interesting creatures in there that I might be able to use. The Golden Voyage of Sinbad I watched last night and thoroughly enjoyed it. The villain is played by Tom Baker of Doctor Who fame, who's this evil kind of sheikh. I think they call him the Black Sheikh or something. Really kind of wonderful, over the top acting, but also the costumes and the settings and so on. Really well done in that. So I'm looking forward to this one was 1973, so I'm looking forward to watching this one, which is 1978, I believe. Different actor again playing Sinbad, but I'm expecting that to be very good. And then I haven't yet watched this, which is a TV miniseries of the Arabian Nights. It looks as though it's going to be quite good. More sort of inspiration, so looking forward to that. Anyway, that's enough waffle. I better show you the figures if you haven't turned off already. So I'm just going to set the camera up and I'll show you the figures I painted so far. Okay, so this is the first figure. It's taken, as most of these figures that I'm going to use in my warband are, from set of files that I found on Kickstarter and put in a late pledge for. The pledge came to fruition about a year ago, but they're still available on Kickstarter, and they're called Empire of the Scorching Sands, and this is the Sultan. So if I'm going to use him, I obviously have to use him as the warlord, which is free in the rules, so you don't have to pay for the warlord. As I say, I started painting these before I had the rules, and my one kind of reservation with this figure is that he doesn't look particularly warlike at all. He has got like a scimitar tucked into his waistband or sash, but he's quite happily drinking away out of a golden chalice that he's got there. So how usable he's going to be, I don't know. If any of you are more familiar, I'm not familiar with the Age of Magic rules at all yet. But you can mount the warlord for this particular kingdom. You can mount him onto a beast, either a flying beast or an animal. But I was wondering, in that regard, what happens in the rules if the warlord is killed? Does the beast die at the same time? I don't know how the rules for melee and so on work, because if he's on a beast, I'm I'm presuming that you don't pay for the beast either, and therefore once he's dead, the beast is dead as well. But I would much prefer it if I could find a way somehow of having a character which you can remove, and the mount continues to fight on after the rider has been killed. But in the original rules of Saga, I know, because I never liked that aspect of the rules, that you can't mount and dismount figures in the rules, so they're kind of permanently attached to what they're riding, and that's always been a little bit unsatisfactory, I think. But anyway, happy the way he turned out. You know, I tried my best to kind of exaggerate all his clothing and so on, and the luxuriousness of his dress, and didn't turn out too badly. You know, when you remember that I printed this up, you know, at home, you know, it's another aspect of magic in its own right, the wonders of 3D printing, I think. But yeah, really happy with that as a figure. Okay, on to the next one. Now this character is the Vizier, and he's crying out to me, sorcerer, really. He's got this sort of staff that's got the sort of two serpents intertwined that he's holding in his left hand, and on his back he's got some scrolls, so they could be magic spells or something like that. So I think he's definitely going to be a sorcerer. So that is 1 point. So there we are. I'm off the blocks with 1 point out of the 8 spent. Yeah, not much else to say about him really. I think another, you know, really nice figure, I think. And I've tried my best to, you know, sort of exaggerate all the bling and so on. And really pleased with the way his turned out. Right, now the next one I'm going to show you, a little bit more problematic. I'm not sure even whether I'm going to be able to use it. Right, now this is a larger model. It represents a djinn or a genie or a jan, however you want to pronounce it. Yeah, the problem I have now is that I'm allowed a monster, he's clearly not a monster, and I'm allowed 2 creatures, and he's clearly not a creature because he's sort of got human form. So the only thing I can think of really, because genies were so integral to, you know, the Arabian Nights, it's one of the first things you think of, the sort of genie and the lamp kind of thing. I've got to be able to use these genies. I've got 4 that I could paint up. This is the first one. So the only thing I can think of is that you're allowed multiple sorcerers. So maybe use him as a sorcerer. So I think that's what I'm going to have to do. So I'm not going to be able to paint up too many genies because, you know, there's a limit on how many sorcerers. It's going to become very unbalanced. Despite the fact that you can have multiple sorcerers, you don't want too many in your army. Otherwise, it's going to be a very kind of one-sided, unbalanced kind of army. But you know, nice fun to paint up. Just having problems sort of jemmying some of these things, as I say, into the Saga Age of Magic mindset, really. Right, on to the next one. Okay, now this guy, not sure whether I'm going to be able to use him at all. Basically, in the files, there's a folder that's called Marauders. So he is a Marauder. Now, there are 3 of them. One of the others I'm going to show you next, who I'm going to reserve for a different purpose. So that leaves me with 2. So I've got another one. The second of the 2 I haven't painted up yet, although I have got it printed now. So what I could do maybe is because the next figure I'm going to show you I'm going to use as a paladin, and in order to acquire paladin you have to sacrifice 2 Hearthguard. So I could pretend that I've painted up 4 Hearthguard but only paint up 2, this one and the other Marauder, and then spend the half a point, as it were, on the paladin. So that's one possibility that I may well do. But the other problem is that I'm going to need, quite a large, size sort of body of warriors or Hearthguard like this, and only having the 2 versions to print off, it's going to be very kind of repetitive. So what I've done is I've purchased another file from my mini factory website, which Chris at Walkabout Games put me onto. Thank you for that. Heads up on that. So I bought a file which has got 5 or 6 warriors in it, and they've all got an Arabian Nights theme, which is perfect. They're all similar scale to this, which is about 32mm, and they have got 5 torsos, but the legs and not the legs, the arms and the weaponry and so on is all multi-part, so I can swap arms and weapons around and shields and make those, give a lot of variety to those 5. So that should be perfect. And then maybe just put him in with those, I don't know, but then the style is slightly different, so he will stand out as being, even though the size is right, the style of dress and so on is a bit different. So that might be the way around it, is to paint up the other Marauder and just have that representing a group of 4 that's gone down to 2 because I've used it to buy a paladin. Yeah, okay, you had a long enough look at that one, so I'll just show you the last one I've got to show you for today. Okay, now you probably can't tell, but this figure is a lot larger than the previous one I just showed you, although he is in that group of 3 Marauders. Now he's got his own specific name. The other 2 are just Marauder 1 and Marauder 2. This guy is the Brute. Let's just put him a bit more in the centre there so he's not oscillating too much. Yeah, so he's sort of head and shoulders above that last one I showed you. And I want to use him as a paladin, as I say, which you're allowed to purchase in the faction-specific rules for the Great Kingdom. And if he's on foot, he's allowed to carry a heavy weapon, and he's certainly got that in terms of that huge scimitar. So he's going to be perfect for that, I think. I don't know if you've noticed on some of them that some of them were damaged slightly as I took them off the build plate. So this one, he's got a little sort of bit missing off the back of his base there, but it doesn't look too bad. So rather than print him up again, I just got on with painting him. Anyway, yeah, this turned into a long video this, so I'll stop at that point and say goodbye until I'll try and do a sort of weekly update, I think, on this project, because I should have some more painted by the end of next week and let you see how I'm getting on. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.